I'm very excited to introduce our next presenter. Sarah Russell is a lecturer in the Maritime and Supply Chain Management program at Old Dominion University. ODU is a university just a couple miles down the road. A number of ex-Tupelo employees are, in fact, alumni of ODU. Ms. Russell created and implemented the course curriculum that was designed to provide students with an integrated working knowledge of maritime operations and supply chain management. Ms. Russell is also a certified port executive. Prior to joining the faculty at ODU, Ms. Russell's career included positions in various fields, including transportation and logistics, port operations, and customs brokerage. She holds a Master's of Business Administration with concentrations in maritime, ports and logistics management, and international business from ODU, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Delaware. Sarah has been a friend of ex-Tupelo for a number of years. We've been fortunate enough to gain a number of interns, students from her class, so she has introduced ex-Tupelo to her students over the years. We're very appreciative of that. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Russell.
Again, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Danielle, for that warm welcome, and thank you, ex-Tupelo, for inviting me to speak to you all this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about changes that we're seeing within the maritime as well as the transportation industry that have significant or will have a significant impact upon your supply chain. And certainly some of you may actually already be seeing the effects of the drivers that I'm going to talk about in just a minute. But ultimately, these are issues that as supply chain managers we need to recognize that what is happening in the marine environment is certainly going to drive the flow of inventory, the cargo that we're receiving on a regular basis. So the number one driver that we're seeing within the industry is the emphasis that the steamship lines are placing on larger and larger vessels. If we look at the growth of vessels over time, you can see that even when we were into the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, our vessels were growing at incredible paces. And in the past at least 5 years or so, we've seen steamship lines build and continuously put on their order books vessels that are upwards of 12,000 TEUs, or 20-foot equivalent units, 20-foot containers. And at this point in time, we're seeing the emphasis by the larger organizations like the Maersks and the CMA CGMs of the world, emphasizing and putting their investment towards vessels that are even greater than 16,000 TEUs, now 18,000 TEUs. And there were discussions even last week amongst several liners moving towards 19,000 TEUs. So that's a significant volume of cargo on a single ship. And so now, instead of our traditional characteristic of Post-Panamax ships, now our Suez Max ships, we now have what is considered our ultra-large container vessels, our ULCVs. And when we examine the basis behind this construction and the basis behind the need for such vessels, we see that the liners are emphasizing these vessels rather than a 7,000 TEU ship or even an 8,500 TEU ship, simply from the perspective that they're able to achieve economies of scale with these larger vessels. Other drivers include the fact that as consumers and as population sizes are increasing, we as consumers will consistently demand more cargo, more international cargo, whether it's works in progress or essentially final products. Our buying behaviors will continue to grow and expand and so forth. So population center growth is a significant driver in terms of the construction of these new vessels. Also, the liners are entering into various vessel sharing agreements, and this has become a very significant topic, particularly over the last 2 years. Some of you may have heard of the P3 alliance that was approved by the United States and also Europe, but was struck down this past summer by China. They've gone back to the drawing board and have introduced the M2, and now the O3 vessel alliance among CMA CGM, China shipping, and United Arab shipping is now the latest one to come about. And so ultimately, within these vessel sharing agreements, the organizations are attempting to pool their resources. So rather than having 50 ships at their disposal, by pooling resources among 3 different firms, you now have the potential to utilize upwards of several hundred ships. And that's a great thing for customers. That introduces or allows the steamship lines to introduce their customers to new routes, to be able to provide them with different types of services, introduce them to new shipping lanes, and so forth. So the alliance environment, again, is encouraging this growth as well. And then if we go back to the discussion with regard to cost, we see that economies of scale is a significant driver, that if I have a vessel that is 7,000 TEUs in size as compared to 14,000 TEUs in size, I can spread out my operating costs over more and more cargo and ultimately more and more shippers. So that per unit cost of handling that single container significantly drops over time. And so again, we see that the steamship lines recognize ultimately I can save a significant amount of money by creating larger and larger ships. The other aspect refers to the idea of your operating costs. Simply because the vessel goes from being 7,000 TEUs to 14,000 TEUs doesn't necessarily mean operating costs double. In some cases, operating costs actually lessen, particularly from a fuel standpoint. These newer ships are actually much more fuel efficient than the earlier vessels, and in some cases may actually save you or burn 40% less fuel. And fuel is the number one cost among steamship lines and their operating cost structure. The other aspect in terms of operating costs, we have to look at manning and the crew sizes. And simply because the vessel increases in size from 7,000, let's say, to 14,000, your crew size does not double either. Depending upon where you're flagging that ship and what nation you're registering that vessel in and their crew standards, you may be only adding 2, maybe 5 individuals to your total operating crew. And so labor costs do not rise significantly either. So if we examine the slot costs per TEU, or the addition of one more container onto a vessel, we see that if we compare a 4,800 TEU ship as compared to an 8,000 TEU ship, the 8,000 TEU ship has a 47% lower slot cost. Then compare that to a 14,000 TEU ship, and we see that the vessel has a 67% lower slot cost. So again, these are just aspects that are supporting the creation of these larger and larger vessels. Also, in terms of handling costs, in some cases you can have a savings upwards of $75 per container by utilizing a larger vessel as compared to a smaller vessel. So in terms of handling these vessels, when these vessels come into various ports, global facilities, and even for us, domestic facilities and so forth, we're seeing an emphasis in terms of improving infrastructure in order to handle these vessels. And a great example is the ongoing expansion of the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal essentially handles about 5% of world trade. It equates to about 12,000 to 14,000 vessel transits every single year. And the dominant markets for the Panama Canal have been mostly North America and South America. But back in 2006, and even prior to this, as they were exploring this idea, the Panama Canal recognized that vessels were growing larger and larger, that consumer markets were moving more towards the Asian marketplace. And they recognized that in order to stay a major player in global commerce, that they needed to expand their infrastructure. So in 2006, the Panamanian citizens approved a referendum to expand the canal. And the expansion plan involves not only expanding the lock system, which is in place, but also the creation of an incredible logistics zone where they are improving their airport systems, they're enlarging their foreign trade zone operations, bringing in more logistics providers to service the cargo and handle the cargo that's coming through the canal. And so the progress with regard to the canal is that it's nearly at about 80% completion. The expectation was that it would be completed by 2014 in honor of the 100th year anniversary of the canal, but due to a number of cost overages and technical problems with the actual construction process, we probably won't see the new canal come online until about the first quarter of 2016. But ultimately, this is going to change the flow of cargo moving into the Gulf Coast ports. It will certainly have an impact upon the West Coast ports and certainly the East Coast ports. So we have to recognize that there's the possibility that we on the East Coast and even on the Gulf Coast will start to see more Asian cargo come to us directly rather than going into the West Coast ports and then being land bridged or shipped across the United States to get to the final destination. Another canal, let's see, hang on. There we go. And here you can see the lock system that's being expanded. So essentially this is the former lock system, and here's the expansion part you can see on both coasts, East Coast as well as West Coast. The other expansion program is taking place within the Suez Canal. And the Suez Canal handles about 10% of global traffic. One of the most important commodities, obviously, is petroleum, and very important to us that we maintain good political relationships in this region because of the volume of petroleum that is flowing through the canal. So there are two different construction programs, or essentially plans, in place. This past summer, Egypt approved an expansion or a widening of the canal for about 34 kilometers. And essentially, this would allow and improve some of the choke points within the canal. The second expansion plan that's in place and the discussion involves a parallel canal. If we look at waiting times at the Suez Canal, which have increased simply because of the fact that not the larger vessels simply cannot go through the Panama Canal, so they're directed through the Suez, and we see more and more Suez services coming to us here on the East Coast. So waiting time at the Suez Canal is upwards of about 11 hours. So one of the plans is to build a parallel channel to the existing Suez Canal, and that would decrease waiting time for ships on average to about 3 hours as opposed to the 11 hours. Also, this would double or almost double the number of transits. About 47 vessels can transit through the canal every single day. Having a second canal running alongside would allow for about 97 vessels to go through the canal every single day. And so this would be a significant driver for a lot of that Asia to Europe cargo or Middle East to Europe cargo and vice versa. And then finally, the Nicaragua Canal. And some of you may have heard about this past summer. The Nicaraguan government approved a 100-year concession to a Chinese businessman to build a canal that some are saying could rival the Panama Canal. There are a number of different issues associated with this canal in terms of environmental studies that need to be conducted, and is there a labor force that's in place that could actually work and build this canal, and what are the surveys that are needed to be undertaken in order to see the profitability of this canal. But this has been approved, along with a number of other logistics projects and logistics services. So ultimately, with this concession, it's not a guarantee that the canal will actually be built, but we may see some other infrastructure projects that are tied to the canal actually come to fruition. The cost is extensive. The initial cost was estimated to be about $40 billion, then it ballooned up to about $50 billion, and some of the Panama Canal experts are saying that it would probably be close to $100 billion before this is actually up and running and said and done. But in terms of savings for liners, there actually are two significant savings. The first is in time. It is a shorter distance to go through Nicaragua as compared to Panama. And you can see here in terms of nautical miles, about 21,500 nautical miles through Panama. For Nicaragua, just over 20,000. So that's a savings. That equates into a fuel savings. That equates into a time savings so that these vessels are continuing their transits and thus could potentially make more turns per year. So from a global standpoint, this is where we see growth taking place and the ability to be able to handle these larger and larger vessels. Now if we come back domestically, and not just domestically, but also other areas around the globe, we're seeing port infrastructures develop in order and in response to these larger and larger vessels. And this is happening from all facets of port operations. But if we look at the main components of infrastructure and superstructure, we see that, for example, harbors. If we examine the water depths at our larger terminals all throughout the United States, we see that most of them are dredged upwards to about 42 feet, moving towards 50 feet. And these Post-Panamax vessels and the Suez-class vessels ultimately draw a significant amount of water. Thus, the approaches to the berths need to be dredged and dredged regularly. The berths themselves need to be dredged so that these vessels don't have to wait till, let's say, high tide in order to come in. They can come in at all times throughout the day. So 50 feet is becoming the norm, and you will see in most cases ports are examining the possibility of dredging to 55 feet. And we, as you saw in the video here, we have a naturally deep harbor. Our former APM facility, the Virginia Gateway facility now, is dredged to 55 feet, so we can accommodate those vessels here locally. But a number of our southern competitors are challenged in terms of their water depths. They are in the midst of environmental studies, in the midst of examining funding possibilities in order to see some of these projects come to fruition. In terms of our key space and our berth space, ultimately, in order to accommodate these vessels, you have to have a berth that is long enough to support the vessel. And so most terminals are increasing the size of their berths or building new berths to allow for these larger vessels to come to the facilities. In terms of superstructure, if we look at our crane systems, as you saw in the video, we have Suez-class cranes here and operating here in the Port of Virginia. But a lot of terminals are still utilizing their Post-Panamax cranes, which can only reach and only have a reach of about 22 boxes across a ship. And some of these larger vessels essentially are 26, 27 boxes across. So you need a crane in place if you are handling containers that can accommodate the size of the vessel that you are working. You don't want to be able to just work half of that ship. That's completely inefficient. And then finally, our gate systems. Some of you that are importing cargo on a regular basis may recognize that gate systems have been plagued over the past several months by our winter season and just congestion in general, whether it's the gates themselves and their operating characteristics and capacities, or from a trucking standpoint as well. And so gates essentially can be a major choke point for our terminals, and that can delay the availability of your cargo and your cargo coming out of a terminal, and to what extent you're getting it. 4 hours as compared to 7 hours from its release time. And so we're seeing more and more terminals turn towards automation with regard to their gate operations and utilizing optical character recognition, utilizing RFID technology in order to process cargo into facilities and out of facilities at a much more rapid pace. So we see in some cases where appointment systems are utilized for the trucking environment, that ultimately truckers are equipped with an RFID tag. They exit off an interstate or come into the gate, and immediately there's a sensor that is picking up that information related to that driver. Ultimately, what load is that driver bringing in, or if that driver's coming in bobtailed, ultimately what load are they coming to pick up, and the system assigns them a location within the yard to go to next in order to pick up a load or drop off a load. And so that speeds up the process, that eliminates the human interaction, which certainly speeds up the process. So gate systems are a significant area where we're seeing a lot of investment. And then if we look at it from an intermodal perspective, because your cargo doesn't stay at the port, it moves inland. And the ports have to recognize that they are a cog in this entire supply chain. And ultimately, to what extent they can offer intermodal services or efficient access to intermodal services will impact your supply chain and impact you as a customer. Therefore, we see a significant emphasis upon road and rail connections, particularly from the standpoint of being able to access an interstate system very quickly, or the ability to put your cargo onto a rail system in a relatively short period of time. And this is where we're seeing the emphasis on on-dock rail as compared to near-dock rail. And you saw in the video, we do have on-dock rail at our facilities here in Virginia, whereby the cargo can immediately be offloaded, taken over to the rails, and a train can start to be built. Whereas some facilities, the rail system is outside of the gate, and so you're adding a drayage movement to that cargo, and you're adding more time to the handling process for that cargo, which drives up your total cost. It's estimated that we spend on average here in the U.S. about $348 million just draying cargo, whether it's actually to our import warehouses or to other intermodal connections. And so that's a significant cost that we would like to see reduced. Another aspect is our bridge network. To what extent do we have clearance? And as you saw in the video again, we have a channel that has absolutely no overhead obstructions, whereas New York, New Jersey's not so lucky. They have the Bayonne Bridge. And with the larger vessels today, there's only about a 2 to 8 foot clearance for some of these vessels to go under the Bayonne Bridge, which is completely unsafe. And so the Bayonne Bridge has explored the Port of New York, New Jersey has explored numerous projects in order to alleviate this problem for their terminals that are on the other side of the bridge. And they have elected and voted on increasing the bridge clearance and raising the Bayonne Bridge to allow for these larger vessels to transit through and reach the terminals that are on the other side. One thing that's working in their favor is essentially the fact that the canal has been delayed, the Panama Canal has been delayed, and therefore they will not be so far behind in the construction process in order for the Bayonne Bridge construction process to be finished. The next two aspects are components to seaport systems that many seaports are examining. The first aspect are inland waterway development. We're seeing within the United States an emphasis on trying to move more cargo via our river systems, our lake systems, via barges. MARAD has been working for nearly 20 plus years, 30 years, to focus and encourage shippers to explore barging and explore the alternative of our marine highway system. And if we look at the traditional ratios of cargo exiting terminals or coming into facilities, we see that most facilities receive upwards of about 70% of their cargo via truck, 30% of cargo via rail. And so MARAD is attempting, and a lot of port systems are trying to encourage shippers to utilize inland waterway systems like your river systems and lake systems and so forth. From an environmental perspective, from a fuel savings perspective, all of those, there are tremendous benefits associated with them. And then our inland port network. We see a lot of coastal ports are connected to their hinterlands via an inland port structure, whether it's fed via a barging structure or fed more traditionally via an interstate system or a rail system. And so we're seeing, for example, throughout the Texas markets, a great emphasis on inland port systems. We here in Virginia have our Virginia Inland facility in Front Royal, Virginia. And in many cases, by highlighting the capabilities of an inland system, you can actually capture a lot of shippers that have discretionary cargo, that shippers who don't have to use a particular terminal or a particular facility. They have multiple options. And if you can show them the advantages of railing your cargo to a location and meeting a larger rail system, in many cases it does save them time as well as cost or money. So ultimately, what does this mean to you all and to your supply chains? Well, certainly you're going to start to see significant changes to your existing supply chains. One of these comes in the form of load centering. And more likely, we will see certain terminals and certain facilities throughout the world, and certainly throughout the United States, rise up and become what we call hub ports, whereas steamship lines will start concentrating their cargo at larger facilities that have the infrastructure and have the superstructure to handle these larger and larger vessels. So the liners will start and are already operating strings of vessels, strings of larger vessels, and the concentration will be on just a few select ports. Again, those ports that are investing in their infrastructure and superstructure. So this load centering will ultimately create what we consider lumpy demand in the terminal environment, whereas instead of a facility receiving 5 vessels, let's say of 100 containers spread throughout 7 days, they may only receive 2 vessel calls with the exact same amount of cargo or even more cargo on board. So that means everything starts to become bunched up, that labor is demanded for just a smaller period of time, but for longer hours. And all of that cargo will need to be offloaded in that smaller period of time as compared to multiple days throughout the week. The other aspect is that all of that cargo will most likely be released and be ready for pickup at the same time. So instead of having 100 boxes today and 100 boxes, let's say on Friday morning, and 100 boxes the following Monday, you may have 500 boxes that are released today and ready for pickup. That's going to create another strain on your existing capacity and your existing services. So from an equipment standpoint, from a gate standpoint, you're going to start the terminals themselves, and they're already seeing some of this, are going to start facing significant levels of congestion, which then has the ripple effect onto our supply chains. So to what extent are there enough chassis available on those 1 or 2 days where loading and unloading is taking place, rather than spread out over 5 or 6, 7 days? And that's going to have subsequent impacts upon your warehousing operations, your inventory control systems, and so forth. Also, from a gate standpoint, it's going to place significant constraints on our existing gate capacity. If these truckers are being called upon, and even the rail operators called upon to build larger trains or to pick up more cargo at a single point in time, ultimately we don't have the capacity. We don't have the supply of truckers. We don't have the rail equipment available to build these trains. And so terminals are attempting to resolve this issue. If we examine our current trucking capacity, we've seen that trucking is not the most attractive industry. They have a significant annual turnover, close to 100% every single year, and that impacts the availability of drivers. Couple that with the fact that the DOT has instituted some really incredible technical programs and safety programs whereby it's making it easier for them to identify who are the unsafe drivers and who are the firms that are not operating up to code and up to par. And so by doing so, they're removing supply from the existing marketplace. And so that's driving up freight rates, that's limiting the availability of drivers that we have. Secondly, we have hours of service limitations. Our drivers can only be at the wheel for 11 hours during the day. And ultimately, as hours of service become even more restricted, which is what some of the safety organizations are examining, those drivers are making fewer turns per year. That's impacting their earning power and their capabilities. Thus, it's not an attractive industry. So our trucking industry is really plagued by a number of problems at this point in time. And so if we see cargo volumes increase and the timing of these arrivals coming in chunks in many cases, that's going to impact the availability of drivers. So from a standpoint with regard to those arrivals, ultimately from your perspective as a supply chain manager, you're going to see ultimately drayage delays. You're going to see the fact that there aren't enough drivers or the rail equipment available in order to pull all of this cargo out in a reasonable time and an efficient time. And that's going to start impacting your operations and how much cargo you have on hand, how much safety stock you now need to keep on hand. And then that has impacts upon your warehousing operations. If you traditionally receive 50 boxes spread over a 30-day period and now you're getting 50 boxes on one single day, that impacts your warehouse. Do you have enough space in order to accommodate all of those deliveries? Do you have enough space in your import warehouses, your distribution centers? Can cargo go directly to your stores and onto the store shelves? And then certainly it will impact how your inventory control systems are in place. So for your supply chains, ultimately we see that there needs to be improved coordination among our freight intermediaries. Those parties, whether they're customs brokers, they're freight forwarders, whether they are overseas manufacturers and suppliers and distributors, we need to coordinate our efforts with those parties and optimize the capabilities that we have within our existing supply chains. And so if we look at freight intermediaries, we can discuss with our overseas vendors as to what extent they are placing more cargo on these vessels. And ultimately, how are we going to handle that cargo? One aspect is more what we call transloading, utilizing, instead of the ocean-going containers and moving those ocean-going containers full of cargo to our hinterlands, transloading that cargo into 53-foot domestic trailers closer to port facilities. Thus, you can place more cargo inside of a 53-foot trailer, and then ultimately those trailers can be moved directly to your import warehouses, your distribution centers, or even to the stores if they have the availability and the warehousing space or the back rooms to hold that cargo. Also, aspects related to risk management. Years ago, a number of different risk management practices were put in place as a result of major weather disturbances like hurricanes, disruptions to our supply chains like tsunamis and earthquakes and so forth, even labor lockouts, for example. That led to a number of supply chain managers examining the possibility of utilizing different or alternative supply chain strategies. For example, the four-corner strategy, where essentially you're splitting up cargo and moving it through 4 different facilities rather than just emphasizing one entry point or even 2 entry points. This way, if one of those supply chains goes down or is disrupted or is backlogged or is facing severe congestion, you know you have similar cargo flowing into other coastal ports and other regions and so forth, and you're still able to satisfy customer demands. The final aspect is insurance, and There's been a lot of discussion in terms of insurance claims. For example, if there was a disaster on one of these larger vessels, how long is it going to take for a claim to actually be settled? And if we look just at the Panama Canal, for example, we see that currently about $1 billion of insured goods moves through the canal on a daily basis. Once the expansion plan, or once the expansion program is up and running and the new lock system is up and running, we could potentially be adding $1.25 billion to that in terms of insured goods. If we look at some of these larger 18,000 TEU ships, ultimately a claim could take upwards of 10,000 adjustment hours and possibly about 5 years to actually complete. So if you have cargo on one of these vessels, and you certainly want to protect yourself with insurance and so forth, but it may be a significant amount of time before, if you ever receive your cargo or if you ever receive a payout from the damage that may have occurred on board that vessel. And so that will have an impact upon your supply chain as well, and in terms of your ordering, and given the fact that more cargo may be on one of these larger vessels that could face a peril of the sea and be challenged. So ultimately, we have to recognize, and some of you probably are already seeing these changes within your supply chains as a result of what's happening within the maritime environment. And we have to be prepared, whether it's from an intermodal perspective or whether it's from a warehousing perspective, as to how are we going to manage this change. Ultimately, as service providers, we're going to see a change in how the demand for our services is managed, and then ultimately as importers, and even to some extent exporters, the flow of cargo that we're going to start seeing into our facilities. And that concludes my presentation. Any questions? Oh, sir, go ahead. You mean the hours on Hampton Boulevard? Okay, so at this point in time, Hampton Boulevard essentially connects Norfolk International Terminals to the Midtown Tunnel and to our facilities that are in Portsmouth. And at this point in time, there is the restriction from 4 p.m. after that truckers cannot be on Hampton Boulevard, given the fact that the naval base is emptying out, the university is emptying out, Centera, and so on and so forth. The proposal is that ultimately that ban move to 7 p.m. So 7 p.m. onwards, we cannot have truckers on Hampton Boulevard. And the reason behind that essentially is the fact that the port is attempting to put in place an appointment system and allow for truckers to come through, instead of bunching up, have that demand for the cargo spread out throughout the entire day. And what the CEO of the port has essentially said is that an appointment system will not work with the current operating structure of Hampton Boulevard. It has to be pushed back later, because the latest a trucker could essentially pick up a load is possibly 2:30 in order to get back out onto the road and get down Hampton Boulevard and outwards. So they're saying 2, maybe 3 p.m. at the max is the latest you could have an appointment system. We can't run a terminal when we only have operating hours from 7 a.m. to 3 or 8 a.m. to 3. And so from my perspective, hopefully it does get pushed backwards in order to allow for that cargo to flow through. Otherwise, they're going to have to they'll have to continue moving on to 264 or 64, 264, and so forth, and moving away from Colley and Church Street and so forth. Mm-hmm. Yes? Mm-hmm. I think there is although in theory that is what we should see happen, and we see that throughout Europe, for example, Antwerp and Rotterdam are the great hubs, and then you see that they are fed cargo. The challenge will be here is who's going to become a secondary port. I don't think you'll necessarily see ports shut down. I think you will see them move towards more of a secondary role or more of a niche operation, whereby maybe we'll see, for example, we already see Wilmington, North Carolina, for example, more of a niche port and not really a major player on the East Coast. You'll see New York, New Jersey will always be a dominant facility. It has a population size that warrants the fact that cargo will come through. If they can't get through the Bayonne Bridge, terminals will be built outside so that it can be accommodated. Here in Hampton Roads, we should become one of those significant facilities because we have the intermodal connections, the deep water, and so forth. As you get towards more of the South Atlantic, you'll probably start to see Charleston and Savannah battle it out as to who's going to be able to accept these larger vessels. Both are constrained by their water depths, and it's going to be a good 5 to 8 years before we actually see their water depths come on par with Hampton Roads as well as New York, New Jersey. We'll probably see the Florida ports become more secondary facilities, simply because in many cases it's challenging to get cargo out of those facilities and away from the urban areas to move into the Midwest part of the U.S. or even the western states and so forth. On the West Coast, you'll see LA Long Beach will dominate. That's just a given. You'll probably see Seattle and Tacoma maybe move towards a more secondary perspective because you have Prince Rupert and Vancouver, which are incredible facilities, and they have great rail networks that can get cargo to Chicago and to the Midwest locations even faster than LA Long Beach can. And they save a day in terms of sailing times. So depending upon how the market shakes out, I think the original expectation is that we would see a 25% bump in cargo. That's unrealistic nowadays. The West Coast ports are still going to receive a lot of the Asian cargo or the majority of the Asian cargo. We may see small percentages here and there, but it will come down to there will be ports that will certainly become secondary ports or just niche ports where they'll specialize in break bulk or they'll specialize in certain bulk commodities, whether they're grains or iron ore, timber, and those types of commodities. But I think that's a definite. Mm-hmm.
You could see a decrease in trucking costs from the West Coast to East Coast. So, you pointed out the truckers, it could be kind of more of a load balance and just moving over to the East Coast.
Most definitely, yeah. And as we see, for example, the discussion of the merger of one of the Canadian rail lines and CSX and the possibility that the growth with that merger, what that could mean in terms of rail traffic. Because the Canadian railroads are incredibly efficient. They have very low costs in terms of their operating structure and so forth. And so, yeah, you'll probably see an emphasis. But California's plagued by severe congestion, and if there still isn't a labor contract at this point in time, and so that's leading to more congestion, lack of capacity in terms of rail equipment as well as trucking equipment. That's plaguing those ports. So if that becomes a significant issue for a number of shippers, they may permanently divert some cargo. And it could be to other West Coast facilities like Seattle, Tacoma, or even down into Lazaro, Cardenas, down into Mexico. That could be a major possibility. Mm-hmm. Sure, Wally.
Are our ports of Virginia right around here so congested and backed up now that we need Craney Island? What's the...
We're not congested. What we see, for example, the Virginia Gateway, the former APM facility. It's a not completely automated, but fairly automated facility. It needs to be working at upwards of 70 to 80% capacity in order to see that automation, see the benefits of that automation and the speediness of that automation. They have opened up the old Portsmouth Marine Terminal. That's alleviating some congestion for Virginia International Gateway and so forth. So several services, because Virginia Gateway is now probably operating upwards of 90% capacity, very much towards the breaking point for them. And so they've transferred several services over to PMT. If cargo volumes continue to increase, but like the expectation is that from 2006, I believe, upwards to about 2020, we're supposed to see a doubling of cargo all across the country. If those projections stay on track, we will certainly need the expansion capabilities that the Virginia Gateway has, because they can basically double their existing capacity and create the exact same structure that they have now right next door. And then we have Craney Island. So Craney Island is very far off into the future, but we could see that in the next 20 years, that it will become necessary. And we're one of the only facilities along the East Coast that has that option. So if you start to see New York, New Jersey become severely congested, you see problems down in Savannah and Charleston, we have the capability to grow. Those facilities do not. So it will come to fruition, not in 2017 as the initial plans had stated and so forth, but we could potentially need it, yes. And then if we have a third crossing, it would make congestion, it would alleviate congestion as well. Yeah. Sure. Yes. Most definitely. DOT has been examining the possibility of increasing weight limits for trucks so that they can carry heavier volumes of cargo, particularly from, for example, utilizing two trailers, or the possibility of using a pup truck combined with your existing trailer. But yes, they are examining increasing the weight limits, essentially, or allowing for larger tons to move on our roadway systems. But yes, from a safety standpoint, the safety groups aren't necessarily fans of that. We saw them battle it out with regard to the hours of service and ensure that the hours of service were passed and so forth. So there certainly will be that component whereby the safety groups are against increasing the tonnage on our streets. But DOT is examining that. Mm-hmm. Oh, most definitely, yes. And that's their number one challenge, is whether, from a safety perspective, should they be allowed on our roadways? Because if you look at it from a hazardous cargo standpoint, there are only certain routes hazardous cargo can take, and certain roadways hazardous cargo can move on. And so you may see that becomes an issue where if you have these heavier weighted trucks, they can only move on certain routes around the country. Mm-hmm. Most definitely. That's true. Yes, we may have those higher waters to allow for the ships to come in. No, but the impact of sea level rise certainly is a concern for all port structures, because of the fact that the forecasts show that in some cases we may not have our ports, our terminals may not exist in 25 years or so. So that's where you see a lot of inland port structures becoming hot topics, and the emphasis on being able to move cargo away from your seaport facilities in a faster time period, so that can be handled away from the seaport facility and still reach our customers and so forth. But yes, I know the Port of Virginia is examining sea level rise. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Well, thank you.